On my 70th birthday, I tried to hug my son. He pushed me away and shouted in front of everyone, "Don't touch me, you old moocher!" The whole family laughed. I stayed silent, but the next day, the will everyone had been waiting for changed. He fainted at clause 4. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought my 70th birthday would be the day I realized my own family saw me as nothing more than a burden to be endured. The dining room was filled with the sound of clinking glasses and forced laughter. My entire family had gathered at Michael's house, my son's sprawling colonial that I had helped him buy 15 years ago when he was struggling to make partner at his law firm. The irony wasn't lost on me now, sitting at the head of a table in a house I'd essentially paid for, feeling like an unwelcome guest. Sandra, my daughter-in-law, had outdone herself with the decorations. Golden balloons, an elaborate cake, even a small banner that read, "Happy 70th Franklin." But something felt hollow about it all. The smiles seemed practiced, the conversations stilted whenever they included me. I watched my grandchildren, Emma, 16, and Jake, 14, glued to their phones at the far end of the table. They barely acknowledged my presence beyond a mumbled, "Happy birthday, Grandpa," when they'd first arrived. When had I become invisible to them? "Dad, you should try the cake," Michael said, cutting a piece without waiting for my response. Sandra spent all afternoon making it. I looked at the slice he placed in front of me. Chocolate, my least favorite. Sandra knew I preferred vanilla. We'd had this conversation countless times over the years. But there it was, a symbol of how little attention anyone paid to what I actually wanted anymore. "Thank you," I said quietly, taking a small bite. It tasted like obligation. The conversation flowed around me, past me, as if I were a piece of furniture. Michael discussed his latest case with my brother-in-law, Tom. Sandra gossiped with my sister Margaret about neighbors I'd never heard of. Everyone seemed animated, engaged with each other, but when I tried to join in, the energy would shift. Polite nods, brief responses, then the conversation would move on without me. I felt something tighten in my chest, not physical pain, but something deeper. The realization that I had somehow become an outsider in my own family. After dinner, we moved to the living room. This was usually when I'd get to spend some real time with the grandkids, maybe share a story or ask about school. Emma was curled up on the couch with her phone, and Jake was already asking if he could go to his friend's house. "Why don't you stay a bit longer?" I suggested gently. "We could play that card game you used to like." Jake rolled his eyes. "Grandpa, that's kid stuff. I'm 14. The dismissal stung more than it should have. When had I lost them? When had I become the boring old man whose presence was merely tolerated? I stood up slowly, my joints protesting after sitting for so long. The room continued buzzing with conversation. Nobody noticed me getting to my feet. Nobody asked if I needed anything. I walked over to where Michael was standing by the fireplace, laughing at something Tom had said. For a moment, I just watched my son. At 45, he looked successful, confident. His hair was graying at the temples, and he'd developed the slight paunch of a man who spent his days behind a desk. But he was still my boy, the same kid I'd taught to ride a bike, helped with homework, cheered for at Little League games. The emotion hit me suddenly, a wave of love mixed with desperate longing for connection. Before I could stop myself, I reached out to hug him. I needed to feel that bond, that father-son connection that seemed to have evaporated somewhere along the way. Michael's reaction was immediate and violent. He jerked away from me as if I'd burned him, his face contorting with disgust. "Don't touch me!" he shouted, loud enough that every conversation in the room stopped. "God, Dad, don't you get it? Nobody wants you pawing at them. You're a 70-year-old man acting like a needy child." The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, my arms still partially extended, feeling exposed and foolish. The weight of everyone's stares pressed down on me like a physical thing. Then Michael delivered the blow that would change everything. "Jesus, you're such a pathetic old moocher, always looking for attention, always making everything about yourself." The room erupted in laughter. Not uncomfortable chuckles or nervous giggles, but genuine, hearty laughter. Sandra threw her head back, tears streaming down her face. Margaret covered her mouth, but her shoulders shook with mirth. Even the kids looked up from their phones, grinning at their father's outburst. I felt something inside me break. Not just my heart, that had been cracking for months, maybe years. This was something deeper. My spirit, my sense of self, my belief that blood meant something. "Moocher," Sandra repeated between laughs. "Oh my God, Michael, that's perfect." "That's exactly what he is." I stood there for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds. Nobody rushed to my defense. Nobody told Michael his words were cruel or unnecessary. They all just laughed at the pathetic old man who dared to seek affection from his own son. Slowly, I lowered my arms and took a step back. My voice, when I finally found it, was steady despite the turmoil inside me. "I think I'll head home now." "Good idea," Michael said, not even looking at me. "Sandra, where did we put Dad's jacket?" The casual dismissal was almost worse than the insult. I wasn't worth arguing with, wasn't worth another thought. I was simply a problem to be managed and removed. As I drove home through the dark streets, my hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel, one thought kept repeating in my mind. They have no idea who they're dealing with. I had spent 40 years building a successful business, had survived a war, had raised a family, and accumulated wealth beyond most people's dreams. I wasn't some doddering old fool to be mocked and dismissed, but as I pulled into my empty driveway and walked into my silent house, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. They thought they knew me, thought they had me figured out. What they didn't know was that I'd been watching, listening, and learning for months. And what I'd discovered would change everything. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Michael's voice. Pathetic old moocher. I saw Sandra's face, twisted with laughter. I felt the weight of my family's collective dismissal pressing down on my chest like a stone. By dawn, I was sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, staring out at the garden Eleanor and I had planted together 30 years ago. She'd been gone for 3 years now, and sometimes I wondered if my family's contempt had started the moment they lowered her coffin into the ground. Eleanor had been the buffer, the one who made sure I stayed included, relevant. Without her, I'd become, what had Michael called me, a moocher. The irony was bitter. Michael had been managing my financial affairs for the past 5 years, ever since I'd made the mistake of mentioning that keeping track of investments was becoming overwhelming. "Let me handle it, Dad," he'd said. "You've earned the right to relax." Relax. What I'd actually earned was irrelevance. I picked up the morning paper, but the words blurred together. My mind kept drifting back to moments I'd dismissed as minor slights, conversations that had ended too abruptly when I'd entered a room, decisions made about family gatherings without consulting me. When had I become the afterthought? The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Sandra's name flashed on the caller ID. "Franklin, hi," she said, her voice sickeningly sweet. "I just wanted to thank you for coming last night. The family had such a wonderful time." I almost laughed at the audacity. "Did they? Oh yes. And listen, I found something you left behind." She paused dramatically. "Your medication, the little blue pills? I noticed you've been having some episodes lately. Confusion, you know. It's probably nothing, but maybe you should see Dr. Martinez about adjusting your dosage." Episodes. I hadn't had any episodes. My mind was as sharp as it had ever been, but Sandra was planting seeds, creating a narrative. "I'll pick them up later," I said. "Actually, why don't I just drop them off? I was planning to visit anyway. There are some papers Michael needs you to sign." Papers. There were always papers these days. Michael handled everything, and I just signed where he told me to sign. Trust, he called it. Family taking care of family. After I hung up, I walked to my home office, the room that had once been the command center of my life, where I'd built a multi-million-dollar consulting firm from nothing. Now it felt like a museum, everything perfectly preserved, but no longer functional. I sat down at my desk and opened the laptop Michael had bought me last Christmas. "To keep you connected, Dad." What he'd really meant was, to keep you busy and out of our way. I started going through my emails, looking for something I couldn't quite name yet. That's when I saw them. Messages from my financial advisor, my accountant, my lawyer, all addressed to Michael, copied to me as an afterthought, if at all, per your son's instructions, as Michael requested. Following up on Michael's inquiry about. My son was making decisions about my money, my investments, my life. And I was being informed like a secretary receiving meeting notes. I heard Sandra's car in the driveway and quickly closed the laptop. She knocked once before letting herself in, another presumption that would have annoyed Eleanor to no end. "Franklin, where are you?" "In here." She appeared in the doorway with a small pill bottle and a manila envelope. Sandra had always been attractive in a calculated way. blonde hair that cost more to maintain than most people made in a month, clothes that screamed money, a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Here are your pills," she said, setting the bottle on my desk. "And these are just some routine papers, investment stuff. Michael said you wouldn't need to review them too carefully." I picked up the envelope, noting how she tensed slightly. "What kind of investments?" "Oh, you know, boring financial things. Michael handles all the details now, remember? He's so much better at this than we are." She laughed, but there was something forced about it, something nervous. I opened the envelope and pulled out the documents. They were transfer papers, stock transfers specifically, large blocks of shares in my own company's retirement portfolio being moved to new accounts. "Sandra," I said carefully, "these are transferring my stocks to accounts I don't recognize." Her face went pale for just a moment before she recovered. "Like I said, it's just reorganization. Michael explained it all to me, but honestly, I didn't understand half of it. You know how men are with their financial jargon." She was lying. I could see it in the way her hands fluttered, the way she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Sandra understood money better than most. She'd been the one pushing Michael to go after bigger clients, more prestigious cases. She'd been the one suggesting they needed a larger house, a vacation home, private schools for the kids. "I think I'd like to talk to Michael about this first." "Oh, Franklin, please don't bother him. He's so busy with that big case, and you know how stressed he gets. These are just routine things. Your signature is really just a formality. A formality. My life's work, reduced to a formality." After she left, I sat alone with the unsigned papers spread across my desk. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, highlighting dust motes that danced in the air like tiny accusations. This house, this office, this life, all of it suddenly felt like a stage set for a play I hadn't auditioned for. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Robert Chen had been my business partner for over 20 years before we'd sold the company. If anyone would give me straight answers, it would be him. "Franklin, good to hear from you. How's retirement treating you?" "Robert, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." The tone of my voice must have conveyed the seriousness because his response was immediate. "Of course. What's going on? Has Michael been in contact with you about my finances?" There was a pause, a long one. "Franklin, just tell me." "He called a few months ago. Said you were having some cognitive issues and that he needed to take over managing your portfolio. He asked about liquidating some of your holdings." The words hit me like a physical blow. Cognitive issues. Michael had been telling people I was losing my mind. "Robert, I want you to listen to me carefully. I am not having cognitive issues. I didn't authorize any liquidation. And I want you to put a hold on any transactions Michael might have initiated." Another pause. "Franklin, this is serious. If Michael has been misrepresenting your mental state." I know exactly how serious it is. After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my office, pieces of a puzzle falling into place with sickening clarity. The dismissive treatment, the jokes about my age and mental acuity, the way my family had been treating me like an embarrassing obligation rather than their patriarch. They weren't just being cruel, they were being strategic. The medication Sandra had brought over sat on my desk like evidence. I picked up the bottle and examined it closely. The label was mine, the doctor was mine, but something felt wrong. I called Dr. Martinez's office. "Mr. George, yes, I see you here. Your daughter-in-law called this morning about adjusting your medication. She said you'd been having some confusion, some memory issues." My blood ran cold. "Doctor, I haven't been having any issues, and Sandra isn't authorized to discuss my medical care." The silence on the other end spoke volumes. As night fell and the house grew quiet around me, I understood with crystalline clarity what was happening. My family wasn't just dismissing me as an inconvenient old man. They were systematically erasing me, piece by piece, dollar by dollar. The question was, how long had this been going on, and how far were they willing to go? The answer, I suspected, would be more terrifying than anything I could imagine. The next morning I did something I hadn't done in 5 years. I drove to my bank. The young teller looked confused when I asked to speak with the manager about my accounts. "Sir, we usually work through your son on these matters. He has power of attorney for your finances." Power of attorney. The words echoed in my head as I waited in the sterile office. I remembered signing those papers 2 years ago when Eleanor was in the hospital and I was overwhelmed with medical decisions. Michael had said it would make things easier, help him handle the bills if something happened to me. Mr. George, the manager, a woman named Patricia Williams, entered with a thick folder. "How can I help you today? I want to review all the transactions on my accounts for the past year." Her expression grew uncomfortable. "Sir, your son specifically instructed us that you were experiencing some cognitive decline and that all financial matters should go through him directly." There it was again. The narrative Michael had been weaving, the story that made me irrelevant in my own life. "Ms. Williams, do I seem cognitively impaired to you right now?" She studied my face carefully. "No, sir, you don't." "Then I want to see my statements. These are my accounts, regardless of who has power of attorney." 20 minutes later, I sat staring at papers that made my stomach turn. In the past 18 months, over $2 million had been transferred out of my accounts. Large sums moved to investment accounts I'd never heard of. Smaller amounts withdrawn as living expenses and medical costs that far exceeded anything I'd actually spent. "Ms. Williams, can you tell me about these investment accounts, the ones receiving the transfers?" She clicked through her computer screen. "Those appear to be managed by Hartwell Financial. They're not affiliated with our bank." I wrote down the name. Hartwell Financial. Never heard of them. "And these living expense withdrawals, do you have documentation of what they're for?" "Your son provides general descriptions: home maintenance, medical equipment, daily care assistance." Daily care assistance. I lived alone and took care of myself. Home maintenance that I'd never approved or seen. Medical equipment I'd never received. When I left the bank, I sat in my car for a long time, my hands shaking slightly as I held the statements. This wasn't just family dismissing an old man. This was theft. Systematic, calculated theft by my own son. I drove home and called the one person I knew I could trust completely. James Morrison had been my lawyer for over 20 years, and more importantly, he was a friend who'd known me since before Michael was born. "Franklin, what's this about? You sounded urgent on the phone." I spread the bank statements across my kitchen table as James reviewed them with the methodical attention that had made him one of the best attorneys in the state. "Jesus Christ, Franklin, do you realize what this shows? That my son is stealing from me. It's worse than that. Look at the pattern, the amounts, the timing. This isn't impulsive theft. This is a planned liquidation of your assets." James pulled out his phone and started making notes. "Franklin, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you been having any memory issues? Any confusion, disorientation, anything that might give credence to claims of cognitive decline?" "Nothing. I'm as sharp as I've ever been." "Then we have a serious problem. Because if Michael has been representing to financial institutions that you're mentally incompetent while simultaneously draining your accounts, we're looking at fraud on multiple levels." That afternoon, James arranged for me to see Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a neurologist who specialized in cognitive assessments. The tests were thorough and exhausting, but the results were unambiguous. "Mr. George, your cognitive function is well within normal range for your age. Better than normal, actually. There's no evidence of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any other condition that would impair your judgment or decision-making ability." "Doctor, if someone were claiming I had cognitive issues, what would that look like on paper?" She frowned. "Well, they'd need medical documentation, a formal diagnosis. Have you been diagnosed with anything like that?" "Not by any doctor I've seen." That evening, I sat in my study with a legal pad, writing down everything I could remember from the past 2 years. Every dismissive comment, every decision made without consulting me, every time someone had suggested I was forgetting things or getting confused. The pattern was clear now. They'd been building a case against my mental competency while simultaneously stealing from me. But I needed proof of how deep this went. I called Robert Chen again. "Franklin, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. I did some checking on my end." "What did you find?" "Your son contacted 3 of our former business associates in the past 6 months. He told them you were looking to sell some of your remaining equity stakes in various ventures, but that you needed help because of your condition." My blood pressure spiked. "What condition?" "He said you were showing signs of early dementia but were too proud to admit it. He asked them to approach you gently about liquidating your holdings because you needed the money for specialized care." Specialized care? I was living independently in my own home, driving myself to the grocery store, managing my own daily life without any assistance. Robert, I need names. Everyone he contacted. The list was longer than I'd expected. Michael had been methodically approaching every aspect of my financial life, painting a picture of a declining old man who needed to liquidate assets for his own good. That night, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week ago. I was going to investigate my own son. I started with social media, something I'd never paid much attention to before. Sandra's Facebook page was a treasure trove of information. Photos of expensive vacations I'd never heard about. Pictures of jewelry that cost more than most people's cars. Comments about finally getting the kitchen renovation we've always wanted, in a house that had been renovated just 3 years ago. But it was the private messages that made my blood run cold. Sandra had left her Facebook open on the family computer during Christmas dinner last year. At the time, I'd just been looking for the weather forecast. Now, with everything I'd learned, I remembered seeing a message thread that hadn't made sense then. I drove to Michael's house the next morning while he was at work and Sandra was at her book club. I still had a key from when I'd helped them move in. The house was empty, and the computer was right where it had always been. It took me 20 minutes to find what I was looking for. The message thread was still there, buried in Sandra's archived conversations with someone named David. The old man is finally starting to show his age. Michael thinks we can accelerate the timeline. How much longer do you think he'll last on his own? Not long if we play this right. We're already working on getting him declared incompetent. Once that happens, we'll have full control. What about the rest of the family? Won't they question it? They already think he's losing it. We've been planting seeds for months. Nobody wants to deal with a crazy old man anyway. I scrolled through more messages, each one more damning than the last. They discussed my finances in detail, talked about which assets to liquidate first, even mentioned looking into assisted care facilities that would be more cost-effective in the long run. The final message in the thread made my hands shake. David, we need to move faster. The doctor wants to run more cognitive tests, and I'm worried Franklin might start asking questions. If he figures out what we've been doing before we get him committed, we're screwed. I took photos of every message with my phone, my heart pounding as I realized the full scope of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just theft. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized so they could take complete control of my life and assets. As I drove home, one thought kept echoing in my mind. They have no idea that their target has been gathering evidence against them. But I still didn't know how far this conspiracy went or who else in my family was involved. The investigation was just beginning. I spent the next week living a double life. During the day, I played the role they expected, the aging patriarch who signed papers without reading them, who nodded along with conversations I supposedly couldn't follow, who accepted their dismissive treatment with quiet resignation. But in the evenings, I became someone else entirely. I became an investigator tracking down the theft of my own life. James Morrison had recommended a private investigator named Patricia Reeves, a former police detective who specialized in financial crimes. When I met her at a quiet diner across town, she looked exactly like what I'd expected: sharp eyes, no-nonsense attitude, and the kind of methodical mind that missed nothing. "Mr. George, what you've shown me so far is definitely fraud," she said, reviewing the bank statements and message screenshots I'd brought. "But if we're going to build a case that will hold up in court, we need more. We need to understand the full scope of this operation. What do you need from me? Access and patience. If your son and daughter-in-law are as careful as they seem, they'll have covered their tracks well. We need to catch them in the act, get them on record discussing their plans." She handed me a small device that looked like a typical smartphone charger. "This is a recording device. If you can get them talking about their activities while this is plugged in nearby, we'll have everything we need." The opportunity came sooner than I'd expected. Sandra called the next morning with her usual saccharine tone. "Franklin, Michael, and I would like to come over this evening to discuss some important matters. Financial planning, you know. Boring stuff, but necessary." "Of course," I said, plugging the recording device into the wall outlet near my kitchen table. "I'll make coffee." They arrived at 7 sharp, both dressed like they were attending a business meeting. Michael carried his leather briefcase, and Sandra had a folder thick with documents. "Dad, we need to talk about your future," Michael began without preamble. "Sandra and I have been discussing your situation, and we think it's time to make some changes." "What kind of changes?" Sandra leaned forward with practiced sympathy. "Franklin, we love you, but we're worried about you living alone. You've been forgetting things, getting confused. Last week you called me 3 times about the same question." I hadn't called her at all last week, but I just nodded. "Have I?" And there was that incident at the grocery store, Michael added, when you couldn't remember how to use your credit card. Another lie. I'd been grocery shopping independently for the past 3 years without a single incident. We think, Sandra continued, that it would be best if you moved into a nice assisted living facility, somewhere with people to help you, activities to keep you engaged. We've already looked at a few places, Michael said, pulling out a brochure. Sunset Manor has an excellent reputation. They specialize in memory care. Memory care, the words chilled me. They were talking about putting me in a facility for people with dementia. I don't think I need that level of care, I said carefully. Michael's expression hardened slightly. Dad, this isn't really a choice anymore. Dr. Martinez is concerned about your cognitive decline. He thinks supervised care is the safest option. When did I see Dr. Martinez? Sandra and Michael exchanged a look. Last Tuesday, Sandra said. Don't you remember? I drove you to the appointment. I hadn't seen Dr. Martinez in over 2 months. They were fabricating medical appointments now. The point is, Michael continued, we need to get your affairs in order. The house will need to be sold to pay for your care, and we'll need to liquidate most of your investments. How much would that be worth? Probably around $8 million, after taxes and fees, Sandra said. More than enough to ensure you get excellent care for the rest of your life. $8 million. They'd clearly done their homework on my net worth. What happens to any money that's left over? I asked. Michael shifted uncomfortably. Well, naturally, that would go to family, to Emma and Jake's college funds, to help Sandra and me maintain the house you helped us buy. Of course, that's years away, Sandra added quickly. You'll probably need most of it for your care. But her smile suggested otherwise. There's something else, Michael said, pulling out more papers. We need to update your will, make sure everything is clear about who handles your estate. I looked at the documents. They were naming Michael as sole executor and primary beneficiary. Sandra was listed as secondary beneficiary. My grandchildren would receive token amounts. My sister Margaret, who had always been close to me, wasn't mentioned at all. This seems to give Michael a lot of control, I observed. Dad, I'm your son. Who else would handle these things? What about Margaret? She's family too. Michael's jaw tightened. Margaret doesn't understand financial matters. Besides, she's getting older herself. It wouldn't be fair to burden her with this responsibility. As they talked, painting a picture of my inevitable decline and their reluctant acceptance of the burden of caring for me, I realized something that made my stomach turn. They weren't just planning to steal my money. They were planning to isolate me completely. After they left, I sat alone listening to the recording on Patricia Reeves's device. Their voices were clear, their intentions unmistakable, but I knew this was just the beginning. The next morning, I called Margaret. Franklin, how are you feeling? Michael called me yesterday. He's so worried about you. My sister's voice was full of concern, but there was something else there. Something that suggested she'd been hearing stories about my supposed decline. What exactly did Michael tell you? That you've been having some memory issues, getting confused, forgetting conversations. He said you might need to move into a care facility soon. I took a deep breath. Margaret, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am not having memory issues. I am not confused. Michael and Sandra are lying to you. The silence on the other end was long. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice uncertain. Franklin, why would they lie about something like that? Because they're stealing from me. They've already taken over $2 million from my accounts, and they're planning to have me declared incompetent so they can take the rest. That's a serious accusation. I have proof. Bank statements, recorded conversations, everything. Margaret was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was shaky. What do you need me to do? Over the next few days, with Margaret's help, I began to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. She'd been receiving calls from other family members, all expressing concern about my mental state. My brother Tom had been told I was showing signs of paranoia. My nephew David had been warned that I might start making wild accusations as my condition worsened. They'd been systematically poisoning my relationships with anyone who might question their actions or support me. But there was something else, something that Patricia Reeves discovered when she dug deeper into Michael's finances. He wasn't just stealing from me. He was in serious financial trouble himself. Your son took out a second mortgage on his house 6 months ago, she explained during our meeting. He's also borrowed heavily against his law practice. From what I can tell, He's in debt for close to $3 million. How is that possible? His practice is successful. On paper, yes, but he's been making some very risky investments. Cryptocurrency, startup companies that folded, real estate ventures that went south. He's been using your money to cover his losses. The picture was becoming clearer. This wasn't just greed, it was desperation. Michael had gambled with investments, lost badly, and was using my assets to cover his mistakes. There's something else, Patricia continued. I found records of Michael meeting with a company called Retirement Transition Services. They specialize in helping families transfer elderly relatives into care facilities and liquidate their assets. What does that mean? It means this isn't their first time doing something like this. They've turned elder financial abuse into a business model. That night, as I sat in my study looking out at the garden Eleanor and I had planted together, I realized that my family hadn't just betrayed me. They'd turned my love for them into a weapon against me. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. I hadn't built a successful business by being naive or trusting. I'd learned long ago that when someone shows you who they really are, you should believe them. And I was about to show them exactly who Franklin George really was. The morning of my fake death was crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day Eleanor had always loved. As I dressed carefully in my best suit, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. I was about to attend my own funeral, in a sense. James Morrison had outdone himself with the legal arrangements. The new will was airtight, witnessed and notarized with backup copies in 3 different law firms. Patricia Reeves had gathered enough evidence to fill a filing cabinet, and Dr. Hendricks had provided comprehensive documentation of my perfect mental health. Everything was ready. The plan was elegantly simple. I would suffer an apparent heart attack during a family meeting about the assisted living arrangements. The paramedics James had arranged, actually off-duty EMTs who owed him favors, would pronounce me dead at the scene. My body would be taken to a funeral home owned by one of James's clients, where I would slip out the back while a weighted casket was prepared for burial. For 3 days, I would be legally dead while my family revealed their true nature. I called Michael that morning, making my voice sound weaker than usual. "Son, I've been thinking about what you and Sandra said. About the assisted living facility. I think you might be right." The relief in his voice was unmistakable. "That's great, Dad. Really great. Why don't Sandra and I come over this afternoon? We can sign the papers and start making arrangements." "Yes," I said quietly. "Let's get this over with." They arrived at 2 o'clock, both practically glowing with anticipated victory. Sandra carried a briefcase full of documents, and Michael had brought a notary, a young woman who looked uncomfortable with the whole proceeding. "Dad, this is going to be so good for you," Michael said, settling into his chair across from me. "Sunset Manor has a beautiful garden, activities every day. You'll love it." I nodded weakly, playing the part of the defeated old man. "I suppose you're right. I can't take care of myself anymore." Sandra spread the papers across my kitchen table like a general planning a battle. Power of attorney documents, asset transfer forms, the deed to my house, a new will that left everything to Michael. "Now, Franklin, if you could just sign here, and initial there." I picked up the pen with a trembling hand, trembling from rage, though they interpreted it as frailty. As I prepared to sign the first document, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. At first I thought it was just the stress of the moment, but the pain intensified, radiating down my left arm. For a terrifying second, I wondered if I was actually having a heart attack. Then I realized it was perfect. I gasped, clutching my chest, and let myself fall forward onto the table. The pen clattered to the floor. "Dad!" Michael jumped up, but I could hear the panic in his voice. "If I died before signing the papers, everything would go to my existing will, which left most of my estate to charity." "Call 911!" Sandra shrieked, but her voice held calculation rather than grief. The paramedics arrived within minutes, just as James had promised. They worked over me with professional efficiency, while Michael and Sandra hovered nearby, whispering frantically. "Is he going to be okay?" Michael asked. The lead paramedic, a man named Rodriguez, whom James had briefed thoroughly, shook his head grimly. "I'm sorry, he's gone." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. I lay perfectly still, controlling my breathing to an imperceptible minimum, while I listened to my family process my death. "Oh my God," Sandra whispered. "Oh my God, what do we do now?" "The papers," Michael said urgently. "Did he sign anything?" "No, nothing. The pen fell out of his hand before he could finish. I heard Michael curse under his breath. This complicates everything. What do you mean? The notary asked. Nothing, Sandra said quickly. Just family business. As the paramedics prepared to take my body away, I heard Sandra and Michael talking in hushed tones by the kitchen window. Without those papers, we're screwed, Michael said. His old will leaves almost everything to charity. Maybe we can contest it, Sandra suggested. Claim he wasn't mentally competent when he wrote it. With what evidence? We never got him officially diagnosed. Then we make evidence, that recording device in his phone. We can delete any calls that might contradict our story. They thought they were being clever, but the recording device Patricia had planted was still running, capturing every word. At the funeral home, I slipped out through the back entrance while James finalized the arrangements for my burial. For the next 3 days, I would be staying in a small apartment James had rented under a false name, watching and waiting while my family revealed their true selves. The first test came that evening. Margaret called Michael to express her condolences and offer help with funeral arrangements. "It's so sudden," she said, her voice thick with tears. "I just talked to Franklin a few days ago. He seemed fine." "He'd been declining for months," Michael replied smoothly. "The doctor said his heart was weak. All that stress from his mental confusion probably contributed to it." "Mental confusion?" Franklin seemed sharp as ever when I spoke to him. There was a pause. "Aunt Margaret, Dad was really good at hiding his condition. He didn't want people to worry, but toward the end he was pretty far gone." Margaret's voice grew cold. "That's not the Franklin I knew." After she hung up, I heard Sandra laughing in the background. "She's going to be a problem." "Not for long," Michael replied. "Once the estate is settled, it won't matter what she thinks." Over the next 2 days, Patricia Reeves' hidden cameras and recording devices captured everything. Michael and Sandra searching my house for the original will. Sandra calling Sunset Manor to cancel my reservation and inquire about getting a deposit refund. Michael meeting with a lawyer about contesting my existing will on grounds of mental incompetence. Most damning of all, they brought David, the mysterious person Sandra had been messaging, to my house. He turned out to be a con artist who specialized in elder financial abuse, and the three of them discussed how to forge documents that would support their claims about my mental state. "We just need to create a paper trail," David explained. "Fake medical records, witness statements about his confusion, maybe some forged signatures on documents showing he was already transferring assets to Michael before he died." "How much will this cost us?" Sandra asked. 20% of whatever you recover, but given what's at stake, it's a bargain. 20% of $8 million. They were planning to pay $1, $6 million to steal my legacy. On the third day, James arranged for the will reading. He'd invited everyone: Michael, Sandra, Margaret, Tom, my nephew David, even the grandchildren. They all gathered in his conference room dressed in black, faces appropriately somber. Michael sat at the head of the table, already acting like the patriarch of the family. Sandra wore a designer black dress that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. Margaret sat apart from the others, her eyes red from genuine grief. "Before we begin," James announced, "I need to inform you that there have been some irregularities discovered regarding Franklin's final days, some concerning evidence that suggests his death may not have been as natural as initially believed." Michael straightened in his chair. "What kind of irregularities?" "Financial irregularities, missing money, forged documents, the kind of things that typically accompany elder abuse cases." Sandra's face went pale. "That's ridiculous. Franklin was well cared for. We made sure of that." "I'm sure you did," James said dryly. "Now, let's proceed with the reading of the will." He opened the document and began reading the standard legal language. Michael and Sandra sat forward eagerly as he reached the section about asset distribution. "To my son Michael, who has shown such dedication to managing my affairs, I leave the sum of $1. Michael's face went white. "What?" "Right." "To my daughter-in-law Sandra, who has been so concerned about my welfare, I leave the sum of $1. Sandra shot to her feet. "This is impossible. Franklin was mentally incompetent when he wrote this." "Please sit down," James said calmly. "We're not finished." He continued reading. "The bulk of my estate, nearly $8 million, was going to establish a foundation for elder abuse prevention. Margaret would receive the house and a substantial sum to maintain it. The grandchildren would receive educational trusts, but only if they completed college without any assistance from their parents." "This is fraud," Michael shouted. "My father wasn't capable of making these decisions." "Funny you should say that," James replied. Because I have here a comprehensive neurological evaluation performed just days before your father's death, showing that his mental faculties were completely intact. He slid the report across the table. Michael's hands shook as he read it. I also have recordings of conversations between you and your wife discussing your plans to have your father declared incompetent, steal his assets, and have him institutionalized against his will. The room erupted in chaos. Sandra was screaming about fake documents and family conspiracies. Michael was demanding to see lawyers. Margaret sat in stunned silence, finally understanding what had been happening. But there's one more thing, James said, raising his voice above the commotion. Something I think you'll find particularly interesting. He walked to the conference room door and opened it. Clause number 4 of Franklin's will specifically addresses what should happen if evidence of elder abuse is discovered after his death. And then I walked into the room. The silence was absolute. Michael's mouth fell open. Sandra's face went from pale to gray. Margaret gasped and put her hand to her heart. "Hello, son," I said quietly. "I think we need to talk." Michael's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed onto the conference table, unconscious, but I wasn't done yet. The real reckoning was just beginning. Michael came to consciousness slowly, his eyes unfocused and confused. For a moment he stared at me as if I were a ghost. Then reality crashed over him, and I watched my son realize that everything he'd planned, everything he'd stolen, everything he'd counted on was gone. "Dad?" he whispered, his voice cracking like a child's. "Hello, Michael." I pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. The rest of the family watched in stunned silence. We have a lot to discuss. Sandra found her voice first, though it came out as more of a shriek. "This is impossible. You're dead. We saw you die." "You saw what you wanted to see," I replied calmly. "What you needed to see in order to reveal your true selves." James Morrison stepped forward, a thick folder in his hands. "Perhaps we should discuss the legal implications of what's been discovered." Michael struggled to sit up straighter, some of his lawyer instincts kicking in. "You can't use evidence obtained through deception. This whole thing was entrapment." "Actually," James smiled, "everything we recorded took place in Franklin's own home, with his full consent and knowledge. There's nothing illegal about a man documenting crimes being committed against him." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a small device, the recording equipment Patricia Reeves had provided. 3 days worth of conversations, Michael. You planning to forge medical records, Sandra discussing how to hide stolen money, your friend David explaining how to manufacture evidence of mental incompetence. The color drained from Sandra's face. "You were recording us?" "I was protecting myself, something I should have done a long time ago." Margaret finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Franklin, how long has this been going on?" I turned to my sister, the only person in the room whose grief had been genuine. "At least 2 years, Maggie. Maybe longer. They've stolen over $2 million from my accounts, and they were planning to take the rest." "I don't understand," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Why would they do this?" Michael finally found his voice, though it was defensive and desperate. "Dad, you don't understand. I was in trouble. I made some bad investments, and You needed to steal from your own father?" I cut him off. "You needed to convince everyone I was mentally incompetent? You needed to plan to put me in a memory care facility so you could liquidate my life's work?" "It wasn't supposed to go this far," Sandra interjected. "We were just trying to help you manage your finances." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Help me? By transferring my money to accounts I never authorized? By telling people I had dementia? By planning to have me declared legally incompetent?" James opened his folder and began laying out documents on the conference table. Bank statements, recorded conversations, medical evaluations, witness statements. The evidence of their crimes spread across the polished wood like an indictment. "The district attorney has been briefed on this case," James announced. "Warrants will be issued this afternoon for Michael George and Sandra George on charges of elder financial abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted guardianship abuse." Michael's face went white. "Dad, please. I'm your son. You can't do this to family." "Family?" I stood up, feeling stronger than I had in years. "Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't conspire to have each other committed to mental institutions. Family doesn't laugh when their patriarch reaches out for affection." I looked around the room at the faces staring back at me. Emma and Jake, My grandchildren sat in shocked silence. They were old enough to understand what their parents had done, old enough to realize that the grandpa they'd been told was losing his mind was actually the victim of their parents' greed. "Emma, Jake," I said softly, "I want you to know that none of this is your fault. Your parents made choices that have consequences, but you still have a future, and I want to help you build it the right way." Emma was crying now, her teenage composure finally cracking. "Grandpa, we didn't know. I swear we didn't know what they were doing." "I know you didn't, sweetheart. That's why the educational trusts I've set up for you will remain intact. But they come with conditions. You'll both finish high school, go to college, and learn to make your own way in the world without relying on money stolen from your grandfather." Sandra erupted again. "You can't turn our children against us." "I'm not turning them against you," I replied. "I'm giving them a chance to be better than you are." Margaret stood up slowly, her face a mixture of grief and rage. "Sandra, how could you do this? Franklin loved you like a daughter." "Love doesn't pay bills," Sandra shot back, her mask finally slipping completely. "You don't know what it's like trying to maintain a lifestyle when your husband is drowning in debt. So you decided to drown your father-in-law instead?" Margaret's voice was cold with disgust. Over the next hour, James explained the legal ramifications. The stolen money would be recovered through asset seizure. Michael's law license would be revoked. Both he and Sandra would face significant prison time. The house I'd helped them buy would be sold to pay restitution. "What about David?" I asked, referring to their con artist partner. "Already in custody," James replied. "Turns out he's wanted in 3 other states for similar schemes. Your case helped the FBI connect him to a multi-state elder abuse ring." As the reality of their situation sank in, I watched my son and daughter-in-law transform. The confident, dismissive people who had humiliated me at my own birthday party were gone. In their place sat 2 desperate criminals facing the consequences of their choices. "Dad," Michael said quietly, his voice broken. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am sorry." For a moment I felt something that might have been pity. This was my son, after all. The boy I'd taught to ride a bike. The young man I'd been proud to see graduate law school. The father of my grandchildren. But then I remembered his voice calling me a pathetic old moocher. I remembered the laughter of my family as I stood there humiliated and alone. I remembered the cold calculation in Sandra's messages about getting rid of me. "Michael," I said finally, "I spent your entire life teaching you the difference between right and wrong. I gave you every advantage, every opportunity. You chose to use those gifts to victimize your own father. That's not a mistake. That's a choice." The police arrived as we were finishing the meeting. I watched as my son and daughter-in-law were led away in handcuffs, their privileged world crumbling around them. Emma and Jake would stay with Margaret until other arrangements could be made. As the conference room emptied, I found myself alone with James and Patricia Reeves. "How do you feel?" Patricia asked. I considered the question carefully. How did I feel? Relief, certainly. Vindication. A sense of justice served, but also sadness. The deep, abiding sadness of learning that the people you love most are capable of betraying you completely. "Free," I said finally. For the first time in years, I feel free. 6 months later, I stood in the garden Eleanor and I had planted together, watching the spring flowers push through the soil. Margaret lived with me now, not as a caregiver, but as a companion. We were both in our 70s, both dealing with the aftermath of betrayal, both learning to trust again. The Franklin George Foundation for Elder Abuse Prevention was officially launched, with Margaret as its director. We'd already helped dozens of families, providing legal support, counseling, and education about the warning signs of financial abuse. Emma and Jake visited regularly. Emma was thriving in her senior year of high school, planning to study social work in college. Jake had struggled more with his parents' imprisonment, but he was getting counseling and slowly rebuilding his relationship with me. Michael and Sandra were each sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Michael's law license was permanently revoked. David, their partner, received 15 years as a repeat offender. The stolen money was fully recovered and returned to my accounts. I received letters from Michael sometimes, apologies, explanations, pleas for forgiveness. I read them all, but I never responded. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, some trust too broken to rebuild. But I was at peace with that decision. I'd learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about respect, love, and loyalty freely given and received. I'd found that kind of family with Margaret, with Emma and Jake, and with the people I now worked with at the foundation. As I watered Eleanor's roses, I thought about the man I'd been at my 70th birthday party, desperate for affection, willing to accept crumbs of attention from people who saw me as nothing more than a source of money. That man was gone, replaced by someone who understood his own worth. I was Franklin George, and I was nobody's fool. Not anymore. The evening breeze carried the scent of jasmine through the garden, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear Margaret laughing at something on the television. It was a good sound, the sound of a life reclaimed, a future rebuilt on the foundation of truth rather than lies. I had won more than just legal victory. I had won back my dignity, my autonomy, and my peace of mind. At 70 years old, I was finally free to be myself. Not the man my family wanted to exploit, but the man I chose to be. And that, I thought as I headed inside to join Margaret for dinner, was worth more than all the money in the world. Now I'm curious about you who listen to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.